Well, hello, everyone. Good evening. A very warm welcome to this King's College Policy Institute event entitled A Public Polarised? Values, Attitudes and Beliefs in Post-Brexit Britain. My name is Mark Easton. My day job is home editor at the BBC, where I attempt to explain our rather baffling country. So obviously hoping to pick up a few pointers. I've got the little booklet. I should be going through that. I'm sure it'll help me in my day job. In 1984, the former editor of the News of the World, Derek Jameson, presented a BBC TV programme. Some of you may recall it. It was called Do They Mean Us? It featured clips from foreign television programmes about Britain. And Derek would end each show with the catchphrase, do they mean us? They surely do. You have to join in on the they surely do. It was a fascinating look, actually, at how others see us. And it struck me at the time how little we know about how the British look to the wider world. Is the UK seen as some kind of weird outlier with strange attitudes and beliefs, or are we regarded as pretty ordinary and unexceptional? Just a few years before Derek asked, do they mean us? Surely do. For the first time, the World Values Survey was launched. 1981, two Dutch academics at Tilburg University wanted to see how economic and technological change might be transforming the values and motivations of people in industrialised societies. Who were the outliers and why? In a series of survey waves, the WVS captured the views of almost 400,000 respondents in over 110 countries, covering topics including cultural identity, migration, trust, empathy, tolerance, media consumption, political interest, the environment, and more. Suddenly, every participating country could see how they compared with others, get a picture of their place in the world. Britain missed out on a couple of waves. We may be able to find out quite why that happened a bit later on. But I think we're back now, after a 15-year break, through the programme of work we're discussing this evening, led by the Policy Institute here at King's, in partnership with the Behavioural Insights team, the Social Change Initiative, and UCL. We have an absolutely stonking panel, ladies and gentlemen, to analyse the findings. I'm joined by, I'm going to ask each of them to stand up and wave, rather like you might on a TV game show. I'm joined by Nudger-in-Chief David Halpern, who is the Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insight. They're loving this. You can see they're really glad they got me to do this. He's the Chief Executive of BIT. And we have with us the Guardian columnist and writer Gabby Hinsliff. We also have the Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester and the co-author of the excellent Brexit Land, ladies and gentlemen, Maria Sobolewska. And last but not least, we have the director of the Policy Institute here at King's, Bobby Duffy, ladies and gentlemen. Well, welcome to you all. Bobby's going to kick off in a moment. I have to say, I love stories that defy expectations, that kind of that turn accepted wisdom on its head. And the latest WVS results, if you've had a chance to look at some of them, they really do just that. You learn a lot. If you thought you understood Britain, a glance at Bobby's PowerPoint slides will prove you wrong. And there's more to come. Tonight is actually the launch of an even bigger programme of research that will run until February next year. So do look out for more from this series in the coming months. I must say I'm hugely impressed by everything that they've done. But for now, and without further ado, Bobby, unleash the PowerPoint. Not that kind of event.
It's exactly that kind of event. Perfect introduction. Thank you so much, Mark. So I'm going to run you through just some of the key findings in what is a very big study, but just a quick word about the World Values Survey. As Mark says, It's a massive asset. So it's one of the biggest social surveys in the world, and it's big in three really important different ways. First of all, it's got a long-term trends, goes back to 1981, as Mark says, covers over 110 countries, around 80 in the latest wave. We're going to focus down on comparisons with about 25 of those countries. And then it has over 290 questions, so it's huge. And the study that we did in the UK is also big, 3,600 random probability interviews in the UK, including boosts in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which I'll come back to in a second, all done in 2002. And as Mark said, first time there were full participants since in over 15 years, and that doesn't happen without a lot of huge effort from lots of people. So huge thanks, particularly to the core team at King's here, Behavioural Insights, our partners at Behavioural Insights team, Social Change Initiative and UCL, but also to the World Value Survey Association, who helped us through all the practical points that we had to do to get into this, and of course to Ipsos for a brilliant, brilliant job on the fieldwork at a very difficult time through COVID, as you can imagine. Lots of disruption from that. And then behind all that, we've got all the funders who supported us, particularly Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, but loads of other funders too, which shows you the interests in this. It's an absolute nightmare for our designer, getting all the logos onto our outputs, but it does show you the amount of effort, the amount of organisations that go into doing these types of studies. And we're only trying to answer three main research questions, but they are really big research questions. One about the UK's place in the world when it comes to values, and how that's changing over time. Who are our neighbours, near neighbours, and who are we different from, and is that shifting? One that focuses more down on us and what's happening within the country, whether we're polarising on our values and attitudes. Then a particular interest for mine on generations, whether the generations are shifting, and therefore what can that tell us about the future. And then the final question around the nations of the UK, particular interest to lots of colleagues in government. How do the constituent nations of the UK segment in their values, and is that shifting? Are we coming together or drifting apart as in the union? So big, big questions that we are trying to answer. And as Mark says, we're breaking this up into lots of different packages to release one by one. We've done 7 survey releases so far on attitudes to immigration, democracy, social attitudes more generally, our attitudes to neighbours, our trust in institutions, belief and religion, our attitudes to that, and the state of social trust, which is the one that came out yesterday. And we're doing this very deliberately to encourage engagement with the research findings. It's a very clear objective for us to collect the data in order to get others to use it as well, to raise the profile of this really important study. And it's been hugely successful on that objective so far. We've got over 200 pieces of media coverage on all sorts of things, all sorts of topics since February, and we've got seven or eight more of these types of packs to come, so it's only the beginning, as Mark says. And we've covered and got coverage of really big issues on attitudes to race, immigration, integration, our views of the future of democracy and whether we trust expertise, all of those types of really big and current topics. But the media, being the media, are always looking for a niche and a lighter niche. Given my generational interest, I particularly like this one from the Times. Move over, sexy Swedes, we British boomers are more fun. Great headline. Ben Page puts his hand up there. As there's going to be lots of sexy British baby boomers in the audience today, I'm sure. I mean, this is just another indication of how they are the luckiest generation from my perspective. Simon Mills, who wrote the piece, says he's not surprised. You'll have to read the piece to find out why he thinks that is the case, because that's not going to be the focus of the presentation today. We're not going to focus down on this as a topic. I'm only going to really try and cover 2 themes today. The first, almost as unbelievable as sexy British baby boomers, truth, is that the UK public are unusually tolerant and comfortable with each other, despite our constant focus on culture wars. We are actually pretty positive about each other. And you can see that in all sorts of different ways. We've become much more socially liberal over the last few decades. There's lots of great questions on this in WVS, this one on what people think of different behaviours, whether they're justifiable or acceptable or not. And this may not be a huge surprise that these have changed. Homosexuality seen as much more justifiable than it was when the survey started. But the speed and amount of change is quite a surprise when you look back. And it's the same on lots of different issues of abortion, divorce, euthanasia, casual sex, all of these things moving in the same sort of liberalisation direction. As I say, not a huge surprise that we've changed, but look at the differences from back in the 1980s, but even up to the 2000s. We were still in the 20s and 30s saying this was these sorts of different behaviours are justifiable, and it's only in the last few years that it's really raced away from us. And we've also changed some of the order in this. It used to be, and of those four at the beginning, homosexuality was the least justifiable out of those behaviours, but now it's the most. So things have changed. And we're much more accepting of, in this acceptance of diversity than many other countries. And this is one of the real benefits of these international comparative surveys, because you can't really pick that up when you're just looking at yourselves. So look at these types of patterns on who, percentage of people who say they would not like to have different types of groups as their neighbours around the world. This is the kind of pattern that you see across countries in the latest data. Homosexuals, we're right down there at the bottom, 4%, only 4%. In there with Norway and Sweden, which is a bit of a theme of the presentation as we go through. But you see it going up, obviously, at the top end, Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, incredible percentages of people saying they don't want that. But even Greece, Poland, in the middle there, huge percentages compared to the UK. Similar sort of pattern, if different proportions on people of a different race. We're down at 2% again with Norway, Brazil and Sweden in this case, but up to 28% in Iran, 24% in Greece. Incredible differences. And we're actually the most relaxed about living next to people who speak a different language and people of a different religion. Out of all of the 20-odd countries that we focus down on for these comparisons, we are the most relaxed about those types of things. So that kind of follows, our views of immigration sort of follow on quite naturally from that we're now actually the least restrictive on immigration for people who want to come here to work. Seen in this question, we asked people, the percentage who think the government should place strict limits on the number of foreigners that can come here or prohibit them coming entirely from different countries. And we're right at the bottom here. UK down here, just 30% saying place strict limits and 1% saying, just 1% saying prohibit entirely. Now, this was the thing that got the most coverage, I would say, out of the studies, because that does seem very counterintuitive given our focus on immigration in this country, but it's very authentic across different measures, with the least likely to think immigration increases the crime rate or increases unemployment, and among the most likely to think immigration helps fill important jobs vacancies and strengthens cultural diversity. And this is a real change over the years. Why it feels quite different is because that percentage, as you said, say place strict limits or prohibit people from coming, was twice that level. It was up to 60% only back in 2009. So we've moved a long, long way in our immigration attitudes. And I think this will be probably a focus for some of the panel discussion about what does that mean? Is that real? Is it solid? What does it mean for policy, et cetera, et cetera? Alongside our increasing liberalisation, we're also increasingly godless in lots of different ways. And I love WVS's coverage of belief and religion type questions. So this is the percentage of the British public who believe in, first of all, God, going down from 3/4 of people to about half of people now who say they believe in God. Heaven, belief in heaven has gone in a similar sort of pattern, not quite as dramatic as belief in God, but this is the line I like, is that belief in life after death has just stayed very constant over this type of period. So we've swapped places between life after death and heaven, and belief in life after death is now nearly the same as belief in God, which is a hugely different situation from some time ago. And it kind of shows the challenges for organised religions where people are rejecting some of the structures of religion, the belief around God and heaven, but still want to think that there's more to life than this. So that sense of spirituality has been incredibly constant. And then the other line I really like is that belief in hell has always been massively lower than belief in heaven. We like the heaven idea. We're not so keen on the hell idea, although that's also constant too. There's a miserable 25% of us who are just holding on to this belief in hell. But these sorts of shifts reflect the fact that we are got less of an attachment to faith ourselves, a formal religion type, that has declined in lots of other measures that we see in WVS. But another important point is that we don't distrust those who do believe. This is the percentage who say they trust people of another religion. And again, we're right up the top there. Again, alongside Sweden and Norway, lots of other countries with much, much lower trust in people of another religion. In Germany, Italy, Poland, lots and lots of different places, much, much lower levels of trust of people in another religion. Again, it's not as consistent across lots of different measures. Also second only to Sweden for trust in people of another nationality, and behind only the Swedes and the Norwegians for trust in people who we meet for the first time. So we've got this very Scandinavian kind of position on these things, and joint top with them for trust in people we know personally. So that's kind of part one, if you like, of this session. We're actually pretty comfortable with each other, with trends over time showing that we're increasingly so, and compared to international comparison against other countries, we're much more comfortable than other places. And I take that as a real positive. I'm kind of a glass half full sort of person. Other people have different interpretations of this. A tweet yesterday from Adam Evans saying, Christ, the rest of the world must be in an even worse state than I thought. That's the flip interpretation of that. But the diversity and the difference and where we fit in the world is a real surprise to people. But Adam and others will have the instinct that's closer to this second truth, the second part that I want to show you, which is that we're losing confidence in some key institutions. So we're happy with ourselves in many ways. Our problem is with our institutions in many ways, and increasingly. Really important to say up front, this is not a new crisis of trust. I've spent the last 20, 25 years, as many colleagues have, trying to dissuade people that we've got a new crisis of trust. This is not the pattern we're seeing. But there is an issue. This is the percentage who say they have confidence in the press, all the way back to 1981, and you can see it's gone down from that very first measure. This is the percentage who say they have confidence in the police, which has slid in a much more consistent way, but also a while back as well, it was going down. And this is confidence in Parliament, which has slid quite significantly. Now, on that slide, it doesn't look like there are massive differences, but that's actually quite a big drop from 87% to 67%, down to 20 percentage points for the police, nearly halving from 41 to 23 for Parliament, and down from 31 to 13 for the press. But the press is an interesting example here because the fall was right at the beginning. We've got very used to this in the teens' trust in the press. So this is not an acute crisis. This is a chronic condition of lack of confidence in lots of these institutions. And the trouble with chronic conditions is you tend to think they're normal. But again, this is where WVS is really useful. We may be used to this, but it's not the norm compared to other countries. So if you look at things like confidence in the government, that's where we come in that bottom kind of section. Only 24% of people saying they've got confidence in the government, behind the US, behind Germany, way behind Sweden and Norway, Greece at the bottom there. Parliament and Congress, similar sort of pattern, US a bit lower on this, but we're, again, half the level of Germany, a third of the level of Sweden and Norway in terms of our confidence in Parliament or Congress. Same sort of pattern on political parties. Everyone has a bit less trust in political parties, as you can understand in some ways. But still, we're not in a good position here, but compared to Germany, Sweden, Norway, and lots of other countries. And you can see one standout country at the top there that you've probably noticed, that China have incredibly high levels of confidence. So that does raise the question of what's the right level of confidence to have in these types of structures. But leaving that aside, I think we can agree that the UK could do with being higher on those types of measures compared to lots of other countries. And then finally, the press on this. We're actually only kept off the bottom of trust in the press by Egypt, which comes 168 out of 180 countries on the Reporters Without Borders test index of press freedom, where we come 26. So this is not all about press freedom, it is more about the quality of the press in general. Incredibly low levels of trust. Again, a really important caveat here. There's lots of good questions on people's connection to democracy more as a principle in WVS. And this is not about a loss of faith in democracy in principle. Support for democracy in principle has actually gone up. The percentage of people who think it's a good or very good way of governing has actually increased. It's more about how it's being delivered than the principle, which is a really important point, because it isn't us flirting with autocratic regimes or other types of approaches to this. This is much more about delivery than principle. And final slide I want to show you in this little section is worrying signs on Gen Z in particular, on their trust and connection to different types of institutions, particularly on things like the press, but overwhelmingly on things like the police. So this is the generational breakdown of the percentage of people from different cohorts, the four older cohorts. Now, sorry, millennials, now you're the older, one of the older cohorts. You see very similar patterns, very similar levels of decline, not much gap between them. But this is where Gen Z are coming into the population in terms of their level of trust or confidence in the police, which is a huge issue. Bigger gaps than we see between London and the rest of the country, bigger gaps than we see between men and women. Gen Z coming in incredibly low on this. And there's a really important misconception to correct here, because it often feels like younger generations always come into the population more cynical or disconnected from institutions. But that's not true. Trust is something that tends to be lost through repeated disappointment over your life cycle, rather than something that you build up over time when you're talking about institutional trust. So Gen Z being right down here is a problem, and something that we should look at and focus on as something to respond to. It's not going to correct itself. So they were the main 2 points. Basically, happy with ourselves. It's the institutions that we need to be focusing on. But I wanted to just finish with early findings from some of the analysis, more detailed statistical analysis that we're doing, because none of that really answers the question about whether we're polarizing. This, I think, very simple techniques does help us to get our heads around that. It's called the moving mountains. People heard of that? Anyone heard of moving mountains from Pew Research Center? They do a lot on their data to look at whether there's polarization between Republicans and Democrats in the US. This is the first time that we've tried this on WVS data, but just starting with the US, using WVS data, just to see what sort of patterns we kind of see. What this involves doing is just creating an index through factor analysis of 6 different types of social attitudes. Some of the ones I've shown you around abortion, homosexuality, and some other ones too. And then you classify each individual according to whether they're closer to traditional values or to liberal attitudes and values. And then you split the population between, in this case, Republican and Democrat. And then you can kind of plot people. So the height of this mound or mountain represents how many people there are at that kind of position. And so there's a couple of things that I take from this. This is the US in 1990. A couple of things I take is that it's quite over towards the traditional values side of the spectrum. But then secondly, there's really not much difference between Republican and Democrats. They overlap quite a lot. But then you move forward to 2017. This is the US in 2017. You can see huge separation. These are big separations of these mountains where the Democrats have become much more liberal in their attitudes, but actually the Republicans haven't moved very far at all in their attitudes. We've had this sorting and polarization between those two groups, so that Republicans and Democrats are more different from each other than they were in these types of attitudes than they were back in 1990. So that's the worry of polarization. So we did look at this in the UK. We have started to look at this in the UK, same sort of thing, but obviously splitting between our 2 main parties, Conservative and Labour. And this was the pattern that you got back in 1990 for the UK, where the 2 things, again, that I take from this are that we're a bit more to the liberal side. We were a bit more to the liberal side of the spectrum even in 1990 than the US. But again, there's no difference between the parties. If anything, Labour slightly more on the traditional side on these kind of social attitudes. But then you move forward to 2002, and I take 3 things from this. The first is you can see our very clear liberalisation in the UK. We've moved quite a long way towards those liberal attitudes. But secondly, we're not the US. We haven't quite got that separation that you see in the US. And there's been lots of great work on this recently by John Byrne-Murdoch and others, making a similar sort of point that we're not the US. But there is also that nascent polarisation there. We are drifting apart, where Labour is no longer even slightly to the traditional side, where Labour is clearly moving more towards the liberal attitudes. So that's very, very early analysis from this type of thing, and the type of power of this data, both being able to do that over time, comparing it to other countries and looking in detail, real detail, at different sorts of attitudes. So next steps for us. As I say, we're going to do lots more releases. We've got views of the UK nations, how the UK nations are getting on with each other or not so much anymore. Child qualities, gender equality, science, lots of different topics to come out over the next few weeks. And then we'll be really focusing on more analysis, testing theories about why we're changing, how we're changing, why we're changing through modelling, segmentation, generation analysis, a lovely thing called moral foundations theory, which is a way of measuring our underlying moral attitudes that Jonathan Haidt and lots of other people have developed over the years, that gives us a kind of new understanding of where people are and why. And then a whole series of policy labs, 3 policy labs around those questions that we set up. And policy labs are where we bring experts together and get them to really focus on what do we do with this, how do we respond to that. And more events, including for academic colleagues in the room. The academic conference is going to be in April 24. We'll leave plenty of time for people to contribute to that, and we'll have the call out soon. But very final point for me, most of all, this is the key objective for this was to get the data collected again so that we can all use it. All of this data is freely available to all, and it would be great if all of you, any of you, want to engage with it, just let us know. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Bobby. We will have hopefully plenty of time for questions, so I hope you've been taking notes. We'll expect you to remember all of those slides when we come to the end. Next up, David Halpin, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks. So I'm not going to do as many slides, but I'm going to do 3. And I'm going to focus on one particular question, which is to do with social trust. We talked a bit about trust. But there's this one question that goes back, in fact, I'll show you when it was very first done, which you can try today if you want to. Generally speaking, do you think most people can be trusted? Yes, or can't be too careful? That's the wording of it. So who would say yes to this? Most people can be trusted. And who would say no? Have we got any no's in the room? So you are really weird. You can be it's okay, lady. You put your hand up. So it's obviously a very unusual audience, as you'll see or know. Let's have a look at this. Am I going the right way? Let's have a look. So why is it important? Why do we care about this question? Just a couple of background details to it. So when you look at various other kind of measures, like in the Bob Putnam work in the US on social capital and community, this question is the single strongest loading item on everything, right? If you could only ask one question to get some sense of the sort of state of community or society, this question turns out to be it. It's also of real interest if you're a policy wonk, because it turns out to predict all kinds of weird and wonderful things. Well, not so weird, actually quite important things like health, the health of your population, right? Or economic growth. National economic growth rates are better predicted by the national average on this question than, for example, levels of human capital in a population, skills, etc. Partly just because there's a lot of variance in it, actually. And indeed, it also predicts the performance of government at local and national level. Lots of things that we would care about go to this single question. So you guess where it's gone, which is interesting. It seems to have increased. We actually have one more data point, which is where the survey originally came from, which is from 1959, which I can show it to you. So in fact, Italy was also in it. We don't have a more recent data point. But it shows you how people answered this question in 1959. See, the US was kind of this wonderful, de Tocqueville, everybody trusted each other, etc. On the other hand, you got Germany, etc. In Italy, by the way, it was even worse. Italy was on 7%, if I remember correctly. And in fact, one of the conclusions was a lot of the post-war Axis powers, they're not just broken economically, they're broken socially. People don't trust each other, etc. It's a very deep, profound thing. And here's the UK not doing too bad. Well, what happens in the intervening period? We'll talk more about the UK, but you've seen it. Essentially, it goes down. But interestingly, the most recent data is it's come back up, right? So for the 40 years of World Value Survey, this is the highest data point we've had. But we were down below 30%, right? Really consequential by the late 90s and so on. The US, as in bowling alone, actually has gone down and continued to go down in a sort of steady long arc of decline. But look what happens to countries like Mexico, right? They've absolutely fallen apart, as opposed to Germany, of course, is now pretty much back up to UK levels. It's not just put itself back together economically, it put itself back together in terms of its deep social fabric. And this is really consequential. So I said, to give you some sense of the order of magnitude of why this matters, is that if you put it into an econometric model to predict national economic growth, it's a really, really powerful variable. And you can think about why that would be. So imagine you live in a low social trust equilibrium. You don't think other people could be trusted. So that's not the world you guys are living in, right? It means that information doesn't flow very well because it stays in little kind of places, etc. It means every time you want to do a deal, you're going to need a lawyer or you won't do the deal at all. But if you live in a super high social trust equilibrium, you can just shake your hands, right? Do a deal. Thanks. Here, Mark. Yeah, come on. Let's just agree it. Or who do you employ to do the job? Also very relevant to the immigration questions, right? If you live in a low social trust equilibrium, you use your cousin or someone you know already. But if you're in a high social trust equilibrium, you get the best person for the job. So when you try and estimate, cross-nationally over time, what's it worth to move 10 percentage points on this? For Britain, it's a couple of $100 billion on our GDP, is what the models tell you. So it's really consequential. So just a couple of things. This is other countries plotted more generally. And you can see, so this is in the earlier sweeps from World Value Survey and then in the more recent ones. And you can see the UK is definitely we're going in the right direction. Whoopie-doo. It's really good. We could have a slightly question about China, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But lots of countries definitely going in the wrong way. And look at where Indonesia is now. And of course, loads of countries have consistently been sub 10% with respect to social trust. And it really matters. Desperately important. So to show you one last thing, I think, maybe before we move on, let me try a quick aside by way of China. I know we've got more data coming on this, but if you look at other measures of social trust, like do you trust foreigners, do you trust people you haven't met before, China actually doesn't do very well. And what's really striking in the data which Bobby's going through is us Brits have somehow managed a trick over the last 40 years, which is that we're now pretty comfortable with each other, and we're also comfortable with people who are different from us. And that's just a fantastic asset. And one of the questions I just love, and I don't know if you put it out yet, but you mentioned inside is, the people you know, do you trust the people you know? It's like, well, that's a stupid question in Britain, you think, because 98% of people say, duh, yeah. Otherwise, why? Because it's not true in lots of countries. If you look in Italy, not 98%, you're at 73%. If you look in Mexico, less than half of people say they trust the people they know. Really consequential. The last slide I just show is that, because we've all gone through, and one of the questions is, does it have impacts in other areas, is COVID. So here is a plot of the age-adjusted mortality, the excess death rates against social trust. Let me just show you. That's what it looks like. So basically, what a surprise. You really want to live in a country which has high social trust. And it literally has affected the excess mortality rate. Now, we can argue about why that is. If you live in a high social trust country, you want to support public goods, you've probably got better public services. But almost certainly it's also because what really matters is if you're sick, does someone bring you chicken soup? Do people support you? It really matters, as well as the emotional impact of living in a community where you don't think someone will literally or metaphorically stab you in the back. And indeed, one of the questions when you look at this data in the most recent sweep, it seems to be one of the most plausible explanations of some of the, because it surprises people in the last, since 2017. It's particularly rise in older groups, slightly more affluent, but is generally kind of moving across the piece. It may well be that our experience of COVID, for the most part, we found we may or may not have trusted government, probably not, but we generally were pleasantly surprised to find that our neighbours came through for us. Those around us came through for us, particularly in older groups. So that's just my last thought about this incredibly important variable that you may or may not have heard before, but you should think about, we should all think about, much more, is that when you answer that question, and you did earlier, generally speaking, do you think people can be trusted? It's not just some blind thing. It's actually saying that is your life experience. Generally, in your life, you find that most people can be trusted. And that is a much better world to live in, one in which you can not say yes to that question. So that's why it's so powerful, and that's why it's so important, and we should worry about it much more. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, David. Our third speaker is Maria Sobolewska from the University of Manchester. Come on. Are we all going? Sorry. right. Right. Well, thank you very much indeed, David. Our next speaker
is still Maria as well. Brilliant. Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. And I have one of those situations in life when I have almost too many thoughts to kind of sensibly cover them all. So I'm going to start with a personal anecdote, which is about high trust society and living in one. So Poland was disappointingly not on your graphs, but Poland is a very low trust society, and this is where I was born and raised. And I often speak to my neighbors and people that I work with about various aspects of life in the UK. And one of my favorite things about living in the UK is Halloween. And the reason for that is because I think it's a perfect illustration about this high trust. We literally let our children run around and knock on strangers' doors and ask for sweets. And we don't think they're going to be murdered or kidnapped, which I think in low trust societies that definitely would have been a possibility, certainly thinking about countries like Mexico or other at the bottom. So this is really important for our everyday lives, and I don't think we appreciate that enough. So there's absolutely, as a kind of immigrant, that's one of the big things that I appreciate about our lovely country. So my specialism is in race and ethnic minorities and attitudes towards ethnic minorities, and also immigration. So I think one of the most important things about this particular data is how our attitudes to all those groups seem to have changed. And I have kind of two trains of thought about that. One is that actually I am not surprised that they have changed. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, even though we have seen, and especially with Brexit and a kind of fallout out of Brexit, immediately after Brexit, we have seen that polarisation around immigration especially, but also the place of ethnic minority Britons in this country. Many of them felt unwelcome, targeted, and excluded by the Leave campaign and the whole debate about Brexit. What we actually have seen when we looked at the data is that people, yes, people really did care about immigration and people wanted it controlled, but at no point did we actually see Britain being particularly, certainly internationally, intolerant towards immigrants or minorities. So yes, we have seen people saying immigration was the most important problem facing the country, but we never saw large numbers of people saying that they were unwilling to live next to an ethnic minority person, for example. So already since the 70s, we have seen on that kind of question a steady decrease in the number of people who felt that way. So in a way, I kind of always expected it to go on. And I do think that another very important thing to think about when we think about those changes of attitudes is that they always seem to be going on at different paces between different kinds of people. And I think this is really what Brexit exposed, and this is why we have this whole debate about culture wars. Not because we are not all moving in the same direction, as those moving mountains showed, we are all liberalizing, we are going in the same direction. But of course, when we think about people we know, people we met, people who voted Leave, people who voted Remain, they are moving at different speeds, okay? And I think when an issue becomes very politically loaded, of course, that speed, that difference in speed becomes very important. Because, of course, the people who are moving the fastest now turn back and judge the people who are moving the slowest. So it no longer matters that we're both moving in the same direction. What matters is that the people at the forefront are not judging the people who have been left behind and are moving slower. And here, I think, is a very important point, going back to this theme of this is not America. Because, of course, this is not America, and we've seen we are more like Sweden and more like Norway in so many respects. But we also are a little bit like America, and we should really worry about it. And there are two big ways in which we are like America. The first one, we have two-party system. And what that encourages is for one of those parties to try to make this small difference of speed with which we are going in liberalizing direction into a big thing. And I think this is certainly what we've seen with the current government. and we have seen post-Brexit very strongly, is that there are political options out there that are literally trying to leverage that judgment that we have towards each other about the speed of movement and are trying to polarize it, okay? So this is the number one. And the number two is that we do now have this extremely salient role of ethnicity and race in Britain. And of course, when we think about the horrific colonialism and slavery and all those horrific historical things that Britain was involved in, it is very easy, and this is what the younger generations often say, yes, this is like America, but in fact it isn't. And I think we have to be very careful to try to chart our own way through those issues of racial inequality, discrimination, and diversity. And I have not actually bought it yet, so I'm slightly worried about recommending it, but it looks amazing. Tumiwa Owolade has written a book literally titled "This is Not America," which is, I always feel like I want to put it on all my presentations about my work, because British, kind of non-white Britons, as we count them in a survey, surveys and a census, they have a very different history. They've come from different countries, they've come through different pathways, and they have had a very different kind of trajectory when they've come to Britain. So yes, they have experienced a lot of discrimination, we have a lot of evidence of that, but also they were, almost all of them were entitled to vote upon arrival. And that of course makes a huge difference, because they always had that political power to express, to influence our politics. So again, copying from America, as sadly a lot of the younger generations are trying to do, all the kind of anti-racial solutions, I think is also a problem. And it might start feeding into this polarization dynamic when we have, on the one hand, political forces trying to remind us that we are too woke and we're moving too fast and we are judging those who are behind us. But on the other end, there are those people who say, yes, we are like America and we should be like that, and we are plowing on. So hopefully this generalized trust will also make us be more able to talk to each other. And certainly with immigration, I think it has started to happen. The one thought that I had watching that slide is that Britain truly has a Brexit hangover. It's like, I'll never drink again. I'll never be anti-immigrant again. I'm sorry. And I think hopefully we'll stick to it. We'll have some kind of dry January version of being welcoming towards immigrants. And I guess I would like to conclude with this kind of reminder that I do think polarization is ultimately not so much about our society as it is about our politics. And the politicians have a responsibility to lead on things like immigration, diversity, etc., and not try to look at surveys to see what can they exploit, what can win them 3 votes at the next election, if that thing will then end up polarizing us and dividing us further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to questions. This is so fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, Maria. Gabby Hinsliff.
Hello.
Hello.
Lovely to be here representing, obviously, the world's second worst trusted press. Very much planning to turn that around one sexy boomer story at a time. Might take a while. But it's lovely to be able to start an event actually on an even vaguely optimistic note for once, in that, you know, in a conclusion that we actually quite like each other really, which is not a sentiment that we've much heard over the last few years. And I want to talk a little bit about why it might be that we haven't heard that much over the last few years. Because I would probably, my ill-informed hunch would have been at any point during the last few years that if you'd cornered us and said, and asked, you know, most of us would have said that we quite like our neighbours, our friends, the people we run into on a daily basis. But we would simultaneously have said, or felt, that Britain had become an angry, divided, acrimonious, illiberal, intolerant kind of place. And it's a bit like, it reminds me of the complaint that I used to hear all the time from Downing Street in the days when the NHS had not yet fallen apart, which was that even in relatively good times, if you ask people in focus groups about their own personal experience of the NHS, like the last time they went to the doctor, they would say, oh yes, I love my GP, or, you know, I went to A&E and the nurses were lovely. But if you ask them about then, went on to talk about the NHS as an institution, they would say, oh no, it's terrible, it's on its knees. And that's because one stems from personal experience, and most people's personal experience, you know, is more good than bad. And the other stems from what you've read in the papers, which tends to weigh towards the bad, because I went to the GP and nothing bad happened is not actually a story. There are obviously limits to this theory. Eventually an NHS crisis can advance to the point where a lot of people's own recent personal experience is just as awful as anything they've read, and that's when sort of perception of a crisis meets the reality of a crisis. But it seems to me with polarisation, those streams never quite crossed. There was always an odd mismatch between how we perceived ourselves to be as a country and how we actually are. And speaking as a journalist, I want to think a bit about how my particular, obviously deeply untrusted institution has contributed to that. I don't think media is the prime cause of polarisation. I actually think economics is, but I'm not an economist. So I'll talk about the bit I know. If we're not actually that polarised as a country, why do we keep telling ourselves that we are? Polarisation is a word used very casually, so I suppose I better define what I mean by it, which is more than just, you know, disagreement, or more, there's always been lively disagreement. To me, it implies, firstly, a sense that competing or opposed political parties themselves have been pushed to the extreme of their sort of belief system, to a point where, you know, William Hague is being denounced by Eurosceptics as a soppy liberal, and Kemi Badenoch is a sellout, and Tom Watson is now apparently a filthy Blairite. But the second thing I think that's necessary to it is a climate of heightened emotion, real kind of hatred, bitterness, anger, revolving around an issue that evokes strong personal emotions, strong enough that it starts to fracture personal relationships. So friends fall out, you know, spouses fight, death threats are issued against politicians, and people are made to feel that you can't have a friend on the other side. And what we've learned of late is that referendums with narrow margins for victory on very big, seemingly irreversible economic shifts that affect us all, whether that's Brexit or the Scottish independence, evoke very strong emotions indeed. But it's how deep that polarisation goes that is the question, and that's where I find these results so interesting. Because the response to Brexit, I think, particularly from media, went in phases. The first was a painful one. It was Remainers realising just how many people did not actually think or feel the way that they did, and realising that they'd underestimated how many people were fed up, miserable, angry, wanted a change. And incidentally, I think probably for millennials and Gen Z, and this comes out of the research as well, you know, the last election, 2019 election, was something like a second Brexit for them. It was a sense that they thought, you know, they really thought Jeremy Corbyn was going to win, and then he didn't. And once again, it's the realisation that actually the country does not think like you do, which tends to make people think, oh, the country's changed in some way. You know, we've become vastly sort of polarised. But in some ways, that realisation was a healthy thing. You know, it was a good thing to realise that not everyone thinks like you do. It was the post-Brexit period could have been an opportunity to rebalance and to reflect and to think about how we got here. Obviously, we used it to fight like ferrets in a sack instead, but the opportunity was nonetheless there had people taken it. The second phase, I think, was probably less productive, and it was a phase of having underestimated how many people don't think like us. We started to overestimate instead how many people don't think like us. And there's a tendency when you've just learned a new theory or a new way of looking at the world to apply it to everything, regardless of whether it actually fits. And I think there was an element, you know, we began to talk very glibly, first MPs, then media, then the public, about the Red Wall as if it was some kind of alien country only recently discovered, you know, that spoke a language that only Nigel Farage could understand. Even though, ironically, what was the Red Wall? The whole concept comes from us polling insight that there were parts of the country that did not vote Tory, but where there were a lot of voters who resembled the kind of voters who would definitely have voted Tory if they lived in Bournemouth, not Blackpool. These are seats that were identified based on the fact that they had voters there who had something in common with Tory voters elsewhere. Not that they were some, you know, wildly different exotic species, but we sort of talked ourselves into a state where relatively small differences between Red Wall voters and the nation as a whole, and of course there were differences on, you know, on issues like immigration or gay rights, lots of the culture war issues became played up into huge, like, gulfs of opinion. And some of that was for well-intentioned reasons. You know, I think journalists thought, we've been told for ages that we're London liberals and we don't know anything and the country doesn't think like us, and we're wrong to assume that everyone thinks so. So we must, you know, conscientiously go out and look for these differences. But we started finding them where they barely existed, I think, by the end of that process. And then layer on top of that, social media, you know, better academics than me have explained its role in sort of fostering political polarisation of the world, increasing political volatility, but at simplest, the case is that emotive, angry content is really engaging, it gets likes and follows, social media turns us all into toddlers, you know, the feeling that all attention is good attention, it doesn't matter what it's attention for. It made people with what would once have been regarded as quite extreme or minority views feel less alone because it was easy to find people who felt the same. But it also, I think, made the people who didn't have those views overestimate the prevalence of those views, because suddenly they were in our timelines, things that you wouldn't have heard down the pub, things that you weren't encountering in your daily life, and you start thinking, God, loads of people must think like this. Meanwhile, you've got new platforms like GB News, Novara Media, the list is endless, which allow people, gave a platform to people who had felt excluded, rightly or wrongly, from mainstream media for a long time. You know, those channels, even if you don't watch them, their content is designed to be very clippable and shareable, so it crops up on social media, so you see it even if you don't tune in. We're forced into conflict more than we used to be with viewpoints that we may find enraging or provoking, or sometimes also very, very rousing and very much, and things that we passionately agree with and which make us feel more intense about things, you know, that we used to feel. Those things were always there, those viewpoints were always there, those people were always there. But I think some of us have been discovering them for the first time over the last 7 years, which makes you feel the world's changed. We're just at the beginnings of learning to live in a very pluralistic world, and we're kind of not very good at it yet, is my broad takeaway. But I'm hoping that we're getting better. I started by saying that I liked the note of optimism, so I will try and conclude optimistically by saying that I think eventually we will learn to kind of come to terms with and adjust for our slightly mad media landscape, which could obviously be much better regulated than it is. And I kind of already see in my son's generation a tendency to navigate it a bit more smartly than sometimes my generation do. But I do think in the meantime, anything that takes public debate and conversation and exchange of ideas out of that very overheated, intense, not particularly natural online world into, you know, real world exchanges, into anything that boosts social capital in that way is great. And meanwhile, for journalists like me, it's really important to have correctives like this data, you know, to be forced sometimes to think, to stop and think, well, actually, you know, don't be swayed by what feels like the public mood, a concept that doesn't really exist. You know, don't just listen, drill down and listen to what the public is actually saying, which is not always the same thing as whoever's shouting loudest.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. You've moved it on from the advert for your book. That's very decent. It wasn't the intent. Very good, very good. We're going to come to questions from the floor in a moment. Let me throw a few of my own before we do. Bobby, I think it's brilliant stuff, and it's for all the reasons we've been discussing. It's actually really important that we see how others see us, or at least how we sort of compare with others. I suppose the kind of cephalological conundrum is to what extent this is about real differences between places, and how much it's about a kind of cultural difference. You saw China right at the top there on all those things. Do we really believe that they are that enthusiastic about all their institutions? Or do we think that perhaps in China it's really not a good idea to criticise the government? So, chap with the clipboard comes up, you're going to say something. And I'm also kind of struck that, you know, is there a sort of cultural way of answering questions? I mean, so Sweden, which does really brilliantly well on all the kind of liberal things, and yet we've just seen, you know, change of government in Sweden, moving to the right, real concerns about immigration, which look very different from what we're seeing on those charts. So I just want to get your thoughts on what we're actually seeing here. Is this how different countries answer questions, or is it about how different countries compare with each other?
Yeah, no, it's always a mix of those things. You need to interpret these data in light of an understanding of the cultural norms in these individual countries, but that doesn't devalue it if you've got that in your mind, and particularly on studies like this when you can look at trends over time where that's kind of factored in. Who's moving where, who's going in different directions, how are those norms shifting? So yeah, it's always a challenge in this, but you're always going to come up against it. And it's not saying at all that the Chinese people are lying or being coerced into it. This is a cultural norm to say that, and it's a different cultural norm in Japan, for example, where people don't give a strong opinion. So you see a lot of the Japanese responses crowding into the middle, and not
where the BBC are, probably. You know, that's the truth.
Well, that's not what everyone thinks. Well, so you just have to keep those types of things in in mind. And actually, I mean, it makes these types of sources more valuable because you can look at them over the long term, see what's moving, see what's not moving, and against such a variety of different countries. But you're absolutely right that then the holding on us when we're interpreting it, not to do that really simplistically and say this means that and this means this. And that's why, when we're looking at those, we've narrowed it down to about 24 countries that we look at in more detail. But we try to make it a selection of different cultural contexts and different types of areas, and that allows us to take more of those cultural differences into account. So it's how you use it in the end. I'd much rather have that than that narrow view that doesn't put us in any sort of context.
Absolutely agree. David, I want to ask you about what happened. I mean, we saw all those graphs particularly about liberal attitudes and so on. Appears, late 90s, noughties, perhaps even into the 2010s, something changed. We saw it in immigration, certainly from about 2012, suddenly attitudes completely changing. Is there anything that you can put your finger on as to why suddenly Britain became a lot more sort of tolerant and understanding and actually confident about other people and trustworthy?
I don't know if I can give a perfect answer. By the way, just on China, incidentally, there is Pippa Norris's work which shows that a little bit of it is, you're answering the question, but even if you factor in split sample, so there's a bit of, anyway, on your main point, no, I mean, what you can pick apart, like on these morally debatable questions, is that they're moving in kind of meaningful clusters. So they come particularly this very famous sort of, in our policy world, bank of questions about morally debatable acts, and they fall into three groups, as you may know. So there's one bundle which is around basically personal sexual values, where basically it looks like if no one else is hurt, then we're getting more and more relaxed about it. So that's the underlying sort of logic of the shift. So we seem to become, in that sense, more like there's a logic to the position over time. But if you look at other morally debatable issues like, drunk driving or cheating on your taxes and so on, which are both acts of kind of very strong sort of self-interest, but particularly illegal acts, they haven't really moved very much. We've got a little bit more relaxed about self-interest. So I don't know if we have a full explanation of it, but there is a moral logic to it because we seem to be.
So when David Cameron, I think perhaps maybe even surprised himself on gay marriage, for the Conservative Party to have made a big point on that, it was. I don't know, Gabby, whether you agree, but I felt that was a sign of something that was perhaps a truth about Britain, which is sort of borne out in some of the surveys, but that perhaps we haven't really got there in our own heads yet, and in fact it was quite clever politics.
Yeah, maybe. But Gabby may have a better view than me. But
yeah, and it had to be, and you remember it had to come wrapped up in a very traditional, he very much emphasised the marriage bit of it rather than the gay bit of it. It had to be like, we love marriage so much that everyone should get married, and I love marriage so much, and I'm so very happily heterosexually married that I just want everyone to be married. But, there was, and there had been a very long run up to that with, civil partnerships and, starting in London under Ken Livingstone. There'd been a long, long time to get used to it.
Yeah.
But I think, I remember the point where I thought, okay, something's changed. It was when Theresa May wrote in behind it, and you thought, okay, and she did it again. She did it from a very much a vicar's daughter, very much.
I mean, that was a great example of how those types of cultural changes are both top down and bottom up. Because when you look at the speed of change in acceptance of gay marriage in the US and in the UK, those types of policy engagements were ahead of the curve. The curve was starting, but it wasn't anything like you would say this is a really clear movement that we should swing behind. There was top-down creation of that, and then people got behind it, swung behind it very quickly. Yeah. So it does. These are not all organic coming up. What you say from top down really does matter and set the tone and the pace of change on some of these types of things.
The other thing that strikes me about Britain, and this is true in a lot of countries, but particularly clearly in this, is about crime and the fact we've seen a huge drop in violent crime and acquisitive crime since the mid-90s. And I'm wondering whether that might have been part of what prompted this sort of new, more trusting, more tolerant attitudes, Maria.
So I don't really know that much about crime, but I think there's a lot of research around why the crime has fallen as well. And I think there was a fascinating paper arguing that it's the lack of lead in petrol.
Paint and petrol, no,
but
petrol.
yeah, but I would not be at all surprised if that had a huge impact. However, I would have thought if that was the pattern, it's happening everywhere, and yet this rise in trust doesn't happen in everywhere. So it must be something Britain-specific.
There is a great question, which I did a paper, actually, as it happens years ago, on trying to predict cross-national differences in crime. And one of the key variables is one specifically bundle of those moral tolerance issues, which is self-interested attitudes. Yeah. So it wasn't the personal sexual that didn't make much difference, or the overtly illegal. But kind of questions, an illustrative one is it okay to keep something you found? Right? Is it okay to keep money you found, etc.? And there's quite big national differences in that. That explains a huge amount of cross-national differences in crime. So there's an argument which is made in other fields by Henrik and others, which to more extent than we realise, the value shifts do in fact drive the other changes in society. Because if you live in a world where you think actually that's wrong, to keep money, then that you can sort of see that's the story you tell yourself about when you're cheating and it edges into an environment tolerant of crime. So it may be that some of the value changes are changing the crime, not just that the crime changes the value.
The other thought I had as you were all speaking actually is about, did the debate itself change things? In other words, so we talked about Brexit and we talked about immigration, and that what happened actually before Brexit, certainly post the major increase in immigration as a result of EU accession states joining, we began to talk about immigration again. It seemed we sort of went on a journey, started to really worry about it, and then it became like a kind of mainstream conversation. And it was before the vote. It was 2012 was really the high point in sort of anxiety about immigration. It was falling when the Brexit vote happened, and the crossover happened almost exactly 2016. So I think there's something interesting, isn't there, about whether actually, if a country like ours, where we do have, I like to think, actually, despite what the people think about the press, actually quite a thoughtful media, trying to sort of navigate a national conversation on things that really matter. Maybe that's one of the reasons.
I wrote about this recently because I tried to match the numbers to the concern. So if you go back and look at sort of when concern peaks about immigration and what's happening to immigration numbers at the time, and there's no match. It's all over the place. Sometimes the concern is high but the numbers are low. It seems to have, and vice versa. It seems to have very little to do with the numbers. And the only thing it matches to at all is perhaps a sense of control, a sense of, or the sense that somebody has a grip on immigration, or that somebody has, a plan, or that somebody has a kind of, and for a long time when we saw that sort of trend towards more liberal views on immigration, I was thinking, this isn't going to last because this is just post-Brexit. This is people thinking, we voted to stop all of that and now it will stop, so I can not worry about it and just put, but that's sustained, it's not just
despite 600.
But I do think it's because this debate doesn't have that same impact if it isn't picked up by a political option. Yeah. And I think what happened, because we have seen those peaks of interest in immigration before, right? So we've seen that, for example, in the 70s with Enoch Powell picked it up, and then with Thatcher again. And then, of course, when this started happening again, we had the UKIP that then tied the issue of immigration with the EU, right? And this is why the debate became about the membership of the EU. This would not have happened. People who were reporting in surveys in the 2004 or 5 that they were concerned about the joining of Central European immigration would have never said that, we have to leave the EU to stop that immigration. That has been suggested to them, top down by a political actor, very successful, right? Yeah. And this is, I think, if we have a debate, we could debate issues endlessly, and the press can even debate them endlessly, unless there is a political option who will say, well, let's put that on the table now. Now you have to vote.
But then I totally agree with that. But then, UKIP, and before it the referendum party, and before it, it's various, different, God knows how many names it's had, have been trying to put that idea forward since the 1990s and not getting anywhere with it. And somehow, it's a coalition of things that allow that idea to kind of suddenly take off in a way that it doesn't.
But I think, it's really important to decompose that there's different reasons for that lower salience and greater positive attitudes about it, which the Ipsos work on this shows that it's a mix of reassurance on some side of control, which may be thwarted and rebound. But then there was also a sense of regret. So you had reassurance and regret. So exactly as you're saying, Gabby, it focused people on what we're missing from lower immigration. So you've got those two things working together with very different groups of people that could go in very different directions again in the future as control is not being delivered in many people's eyes. But that regret one is real as well. That is a real part among a different part of the population where you actually start to think, gosh, we do realise we need this injection of people for all sorts of different reasons.
Presumably we should let in the audience some point, but we're having fun with I mean, Bobby, it's funny you didn't allude to it, but remember a key issue is that people's perceptions are often way out, as Bobby's talked about in his other work, which not least immigration being one of those classic examples, and you all know from World War II. So people's perceptions of the actual numbers, despite they seem to be news, are often way out, and they seem to be then malleable in a couple of ways. One of which is it becomes, when you answer these questions, they're almost like they're a statement of your strength of affiliation to a particular group or position, and then they overstate it. And then that runs into this issue about you don't know what other people think. So this can become quite a noxious mix. So you don't quite know what the facts are. You take a very strong position because it becomes a signalling thing. And then what happens is you misread other people's positions. In fact, one of the great things about this kind of work is it gives you a corrective of what does everybody think? And often it's not, you may be mistaken about that, and that itself has a change.
We will come to you. I've got one quick point to Gabby, which is what do you think are the takeaways for the political parties as we come to an election? This is not quite the Britain that they almost seem to be speaking to.
It's not the Britain they were addressing last time, and you still feel some of them. I mean, the one thing that I would say is that these are national pictures that we've got here, and political parties, when it comes to an election, aren't just looking at the national picture. They're looking at, I'm after a certain type of voter in a certain type of constituency, and I want to drill down to what they think. I'm less concerned about what the overall picture is. So there'll be all sorts of fluctuations under the surface that politicians are concerned with. But it does seem to me there's room for. I mean, I would say this because I'm an old hippie Guardian writer, but I would say there's room for a lot more. A little more courage than is on display at the moment, put it that way, and a little more confidence. And exactly as you said, the point of having the information out there is to allow people who do hold the views that we've now seen are quite widespread to think, oh, my views are actually, I could talk about this in public. I don't have to pretend that I don't think this, Not just politicians, but all of us.
Right, it's time for you to ask. Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Hand stretch, the pink shirt in that, you were the first up. So we have a microphone rolling towards you. Yes, you gentleman there, thank you. And there's another hand, we get another mic. Yes, bring the other microphone to...
Testing.
Oh, actually, that mic can go there. If you bring your mic over there...
Oh, you should do this for a living.
Yes, what's your question, sir?
Hello, thanks to the panel. I just want to say how much I enjoyed all of it. There was all killer, no filler, so thanks very much. Bobby, your research, I came across it first and I found it incredibly reassuring because I got like a lot of people in London, got a great shock when Brexit happened. And it was reassuring to hear people talking about what a positive attitude we had in this country towards people from all around the world. I'm engaged with somebody from Taiwan. Most of the people I went to university with were from all over the world. Their parents came here. But the first person I heard talking about this, and it was a shock because within a couple of months he'd become persona non grata, was Lawrence Fox, weirdly. And he was, on the strength of a BBC Radio 4 interview, one evening, he was invited on to Question Time, and then it became quite famous. So the question I have for you is, what can we do to address the attempts by people on various sides of the political debate to portray Britain as somehow some sort of racist, misogynist, homophobic country, when the reality is that we're nothing of the sort?
Just taking them one by one. Yeah.
Yeah, go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, really, really good question. So we've done lots of other work on culture wars in the UK, and echoing lots of the things that Gabby said, the situation that we have now is that conflict is clickable, and we've got this media and social media that work together in a kind of system where conflict and emotional responses get you further and faster in terms of the information it provides. So we did lots of work segmenting the public on with Ipsos on their culture war responses and lots of different things, and people spread into different types of groups, from traditionalists to progressives, but the biggest group are the moderate group in the middle, and then 20% of people who don't care about any of this at all. And it's kind of like, that's a real good test of your segmentation. If you don't have 20% of people who just don't care about anything about what you're talking about, you've probably got the wrong segmentation, because there's people out there not really bothered about this at all. So our problem is, we hear from not just the progressives and traditionalists, who are about a quarter of the population, we hear from tiny slithers of the most extreme ends of those.
Is it a problem, or actually does the survey suggest that we kind of can deal with that?
Well, it's a problem in the way that Maria has pointed to, because it sets the tone for our politics in many ways, and it sets that tone for our national discourse, which is not where most people are. So I'm working on a book on culture wars.
A book? Oh.
Yeah. Where's my slides? It's very early stages, and it's going to be called "No One Wins a Culture War," because that is the end point. Because no one does win these types of things. But when you look at all the American literature about how do you stop this once it gets going to your question, it's really, they've got a massive chapter 10 problem. You know, you get a chapter 10 problem where you've got great analysis and no solutions. And the chapter 10 problem on culture wars is massive, because it basically says appeal to the better nature of your politicians and media and everyone else, because there's not much else you can do once you get into that, apart from Maria's, again, really important point about the two-party system really encourages that. So if you can change your voting system, you're much less likely to get what is a culture war, which is, culture war is not disagreement, as Gabby said, it is two completely fundamentally different views of the world that cannot compromise between each other. So to answer your question on what do you do on that, I think we need to remind ourselves that there is this massive middle, and what we're hearing is not the whole story, but what you do structurally to get around that kind of problem of, we've got this information environment that is absolutely fundamentally built on amplifying those more extreme views, is a massive problem. And then in the political system, I think we do have that. I think I got really quite depressed about that being the conclusion, and then I went to a thing that Will Moy from PhilFact spoke at, who just sort of embraced that as, why shouldn't we just be appealing to the better nature and virtue of our politicians and actually make that more of a thing? Why are we thinking that's so ridiculous that should be a thing that you would do? And I kind of really got behind it. So it made me think again about, actually, why don't we?
Hug a politician, that's what we need to do.
Yeah, well, only if that incentivises them to be more virtuous.
Maria, I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, particularly on the sort of voting stuff, because you know, we've had endless debates over many, many decades about whether we should go for a proportional system of some kind, or first past the post, which leads to the sort of two-party system. How damaging do you think it is? I mean, if the 20th century was really the time when social science discovered the risks of human othering, you know, maybe we need to have the same sort of rethink in terms of how we get people to become more collegiate.
Absolutely. So I think the issue with changing our voting system is that until about 2001, people were very happy with it. People were like, yes, I have my party, I love my party, I identify very strongly with it. Everyone went and voted for that party, and there wasn't this need and appetite for a proportional representation. But what we saw in 2001, this was, of course, the second landslide of New Labour, but it was on one of the lowest turnouts seen historically in Britain. And many, many people started saying in surveys things like, I don't care, they're all the same, I don't have a party identification, you know, I'm not going to vote, I'm not going to choose any one of the two parties. And I think we are now at the record high, historically speaking, of actually public support for changing the political system. And I think
maybe it was because actually UKIP were the party who really lost out to first past the post. I mean, they got sort of 16% of the vote or something, and no MPs. You know, they were the ones. So actually, you know, perhaps it's sort of it's interesting that it's affecting that part of the constituency.
Yeah, I think it may have been UKIP, but also I think increasingly people do want to vote Greens, and we see that at the local level that more people are voting for them. And of course, with the kind of devolved system, people have gotten used to voting for other parties as well. I think that's a very important point. Psychologically, people now think it's okay to vote for a party not Labour and not Conservatives, because they've been doing it for a decade or more.
Interesting.
And I think, of course, the other parties also have shown they can run a country, which is another thing that we, in surveys, we would have attitudes like, well, yes, I like these other parties for like my councillor, but only Labour and Conservative can run a country. Well, look to Scotland. SNP can run a country. And it's really opened our minds, right?
Fine.
Well,
let's
not
move
now,
on.
but generally.
Is there a microphone in somebody's hand? Just going to ask. Yes, we've got one there. Hello.
Just coming back to Maria's last point, I think, I'm wondering what's a healthy level of polarisation, because we tend to look over to the US and think, oh, Lord, we don't want that here. But one of the things that has happened with a bit more polarisation is more engagement. And polarisation has been fantastic for undergraduate politics student numbers.
Yes, OK, well, that's a huge plus.
It's worked for someone.
Maria, briefly on that one, and then...
Yeah, so of course we do need disagreement, right? So one of the problems with New Labour was that people stopped thinking it's any different to Conservatives and people started disengaging. But I think, and I think Bobby made this point earlier, that we can have differences, but then sit around the same table and try to work them out together. Polarization means that we can't sit at the table anymore, right? Because we hate each other, we think really badly of each other's opinions and moral conduct, etc. So as long as we have differences of opinion, but not this kind of emotional engagement and hatred towards each other, then I think that would be marvelous. If we could have that, please.
OK. There's a chap at the back who's been very, very quick with his hand. I'd quite like to get him to go and ask a question.
Thank you. It's a question for Bobby. I'd love to think that we've become as tolerant as the Scandinavians. My worry is about lags. If we decriminalised male homosexuality early in the 60s, and if we had higher immigration in the 60s and later, then more people come out. That makes it easier for other people to come out. More people have a brother or a sister or a cousin who's gay. More people have a partner who was an immigrant or the children of immigrants. Do we look so good in the London Liberal Women Bush House way as a lag effect of things that happened in the past? Because you seem to be implying it was about a change in our attitudes now that isn't the composition of who is British. Hasn't that changed?
So that could be the answer to the question, what happened that suddenly changed the numbers around?
Just that, Danny, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, Danny.
Yeah, it's just that last point. What do you, the composition point, what do you mean?
It's in a country where so many people are immigrants or the children of immigrants, then the idea that, but of course the US is different in that people don't like immigrants, but there are lots of immigrants. Yeah. But in a country where so many are, it may not be a post-Brexit hangover. It may simply be that you've really got to not like your friends and family. And similarly with homosexuality, because more people will know. As compared to a lot of countries in mainland Europe.
Time for that to feed through. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting thing.
It's a really good point. I mean, like, what you will know this is better as well as me, that it was like 7% foreign born in 2001 kind of census, or even 1991 census, and now it's like 16%. But then you've got the multiplier effect of more people will know or be related to those people through the sector. Absolutely, I think the composition of the country makes a big difference. But yeah, Maria,
yes. So I want to be contrary here. So actually, I think these two trends would contradict each other, because we know that people who are immigrants are actually less welcoming to homosexuality, for example. So the composition of our society should take us in the other direction then. And of course, the composition has not changed that significantly since Brexit either, right? So that would have been much longer lag. But I also, and that's a point that I think it's really important, is that people assume, and this is, I think, where the politicians often assume, people who are of immigrant backgrounds must love immigrants. No, they don't. No. They don't. They are anti-immigrant. I mean, more people of ethnic minority backgrounds voted for Brexit than ever voted for the Conservative Party. Why? Because it spoke to them for the same reasons. So when we look at there's too many immigrants in the country, lots of minorities agreed with that and voted to leave the EU to stop the immigrants coming. So I think this is a slippery slope of assuming what people might think based on their social backgrounds. So
Is it
that's
about pulling the rope up behind you to a certain extent, perhaps?
I don't think so. I just think people who come here and then they make a home here, they no longer identify as immigrants, I think. I think that's so maybe people who've experienced immigration per se, but children of immigrants certainly don't think of themselves as immigrants.
Yeah, we did some trends. The longer you are in the country, the more you become like the country. So there is more sympathy with immigrants among recent immigrants, and then it declines over time. So yeah, absolutely, it's not a simple relationship between the two. I do think there is something about the composition of the country has changed over that sort of time, but it is going from 7-16. This is not explaining the vast majority of those big trends, probably even through interaction.
Another question. Oh, yeah, we'll have a woman. We'll have a woman in the middle there with a white shirt on. And even better if it's a question for either David or Gabby, but you know, it's entirely up. Well, actually, you've both got white shirts on. It doesn't really. Well, why don't we hear from both your questions? That's what we'll do. You do one, and then you do the next one as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. My question is actually for David. So you've mentioned how social trust is a very good predictor for many things, including economic growth. But I was wondering, what are the good predictors for social trust? Basically, how did the UK manage to maintain those high levels of social trust? And is there anything to be learned from that process that could be applied to institutional trust, considering that that isn't doing so well at the moment?
Yes. Do I have the other question as well? Oh, well, you've got 3 questions. Let's have a little bundle of questions. That'd be fine. Yeah, you go next.
I just wanted to ask whether economic backgrounds were part of the composition of data as well, because I feel like we're tiptoeing around this. I think it was only Gabby that actually kind of addressed it a little bit, and then she just moved towards the area that she is more familiar with. But economic backgrounds, I think, are very important to consider when we're talking about polarization.
Good point, yes. And the third of our triumvirate.
Third point. So going back to the generational point, I am very much Gen Z. And I sit in my echo chamber and I hear lots of distrust from my peers to older generations. And I would just quite like to hear if there was anything in the data that kind of signified that. I don't know if this is something I'm just seeing. Yeah.
Did you, can I ask you, did you kind of nod in agreement when you saw that graph in terms of sort of institutional trust among your generation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
That's lucky, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, to add context, my peers and I was 16 when the Brexit vote happened, so I couldn't vote, and we all had opinions. And I think that, from my end, that plays into it.
David, on the social trust point.
By the way, I mean, I gave because I think the underlying story of the change is a very positive one, and it's nice to have good news. When I asked you guys, like, pretty much everybody in the room, maybe 200 people, except for maybe 2 people, said you trust others. But the actual numbers, remember, are still less than 50% for the UK, right? So you are very unusual. There is a lot of people out there who would have said no. That's not their experience of life. And by the way, it relates also to socioeconomic. So in general, people got more disadvantaged background, tougher environments, they are much less likely to say most other people can be trusted, because that is not their experience of a lot of their life, right? So it's worth really thinking about that. Actually, we talk about the Brexit phenomenon. You are really genuinely atypical on that question, and that's worth thinking about why. And it goes to your question about some of the causes. So look, a lot of this data is just really new out. We don't have lots of analysis on it. There's definitely, by the way, a Gen Z issue, which is they're coming in much lower, including on the social trust question. So that's a worrying detail. But historically, people who've gone to university have much, much higher levels of social trust. It is particularly pronounced as it happens in UK data. And one of the arguments is that what happens is you go to university and actually you're in a very trusting environment. You actually literally learn the habits of trust, which you then carry forward.
And Gen Z go to university far more than baby boomers.
Well, that's true. So we look, Gen Z, we just don't, just new data point, don't understand. So I'm telling you historically.
No idea.
No, historically it is the case that people go to university. So there's certain kinds of experiences. So it's not random. It's that if your life experience has been you have found most other people can be trusted, then you kind of carry that through as a default habit, right, in life. So the real big unknown is that if we think it's an important variable, which I think it is, and it's systematically underestimated, the Treasury factor models on growth never have social trust in them, but then why not? is you say, well, what would make a difference? What are the kinds of experience? So, for example, one of the things on National Citizen Service was deliberately, if we get people from different, socioeconomic backgrounds who spend time together for, a little while, actually there was good evidence that it led to kind of bridging social capital, increased everyone's trust. And this even lab experiment showed what you have to kind of conduct this cooperation game, where in order to get points and money, you have to cooperate. Yeah. If you ask people that social trust question after having played such a game, they report higher social trust. So I guess one of the structural things is, can you build a society within which it is literally true, through TripAdvisor or trust, things that increase your ability to actually trust other people, will change that measure, which then becomes kind of determinant over time. So, but it's exactly the question we should be asking. What are the interventions that move the dial if it's so damn important and we don't have good enough answers?
Gabby, I wanted to pick up on that economic background
Yes.
point, because, I mean, we talk a lot, don't we, about the sort of inequality within our society, and we can, I'm sure the data will point that different income points, different social classes will react very differently to some of these questions. Is that something that perhaps we're slightly missing in the way, because we're looking at it in much more sort of national basis?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to, I don't know, Bobby might know, but I don't think these stats are broken down by income.
We got that. I mean, I think the bigger question that the questioner was getting to is that the interaction between economics and these social values is really powerful over time. So one of the fundamental theories underlying World Value Survey is that as we get more of our security-based needs met, we move more towards self-expression values. So you move from security values to self-expression values, and that's where you're more open to things, but only when you've got enough, when you've only got enough security, which includes economic security. And this is why economic security is so important and so intertwined with this, is you can get these patterns of backsliding. This is not a one unidirectional thing where we're just inevitably moving in that more liberalisation, self-expression values direction. As people feel more threatened, they will tend to come back to it.
Maybe some threats coming down the track.
I just add that you picked up on the fact that I mentioned economics briefly before, and I think the reason I did that is because I was at a panel event last night, as it turns out, obviously inferior panel with an inferior audience. But the question that cropped up is one that crops up time and time again when you do anything on a political panel, which is, do you think this kind of whole era of political turbulence, do you think it's over? Do you think we're heading now into a calm period? It's all very kind of boring by comparison to the last 7 years. To which the answer is, to be honest, no. Because I don't think political turbulence ends until economic turbulence ends. We've been through so many cycles of that. The banking crash followed, then the COVID, crash, and then probably we have some kind of AI-type induced economic crash coming at some point down, or anxiety about that coming down the road. I don't think political turbulence and the effect it creates, which is sometimes to drive people for exactly that reason, because you feel insecure, because you're panicky, because you're frightened, because you're looking for someone to blame, because you feel that somebody has put you in this position. I don't feel that kind of political polarisation ends until economic polarisation ends, really. So that's not a very cheery answer to the question.
We've probably got time for 2 more questions. Yes, you were quick. And, gentleman in the middle there. Sorry, I missed you at the back.
My name is Mohammed Sahadid, so I have a question for Gabby. What role do social media and other digital platforms play in a political polarisation?
What role do social media platforms play in political polarisation?
Social media play in public polarisation.
Yeah.
There is some brilliant research on this, which I will refer you to afterwards. Come and ask me. But I would say that the primary thing has been, firstly, a sort of speeding up of the way and a mass democratization of the way information is exchanged. Suddenly there's no kind of, gatekeeping or control of certain, you can feel as if you're in the room pretty much, you can be exchanging views with people who are, big players in politics. So there's been, this cascade of information down, which is great, but simultaneously there has been, as I said, a kind of fomenting of anger and emotion and strong feelings, which kind of rise up, storms which rise up and die away again very quickly in social media, which creates, you know, this kind of atmosphere, very charged atmosphere in which everyone's debating. So it's had advantages, it's had disadvantages. On the whole, I think most people who use it for work are mildly miserable about it now, which suggests that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. But I kind of feel as if we have to negotiate. It's here now. There's no point almost. It's not, the genie's not going back in the bottle. There is no moving away from the role it plays in our politics, and sometimes we just have to get used to it. And when I was thinking earlier, when Bobby, you mentioned, you know, the idea of appealing to politicians' better natures as to end culture wars. I think most politicians are privately as sick of it as we are. It's not something they've enjoyed. No. For a lot of them, it's been incredibly bruising, incredibly difficult, incredibly, you know, it's led to enormous outpourings of aggression and threats against them. I think most of them might be quite secretly quite glad to retire.
We've literally got like 20 seconds to go, so it better be a really brilliant question and very short answers.
I'll make it quite short. This one's to Bobby. Has you done any analysis on how internet accessibility has increased liberalism globally and both in the country over the years?
Yeah, we could have done both, couldn't it? It could have worked either way. Do we know, Bobby?
No.
Fine.
Well, there's the quick question.
Can I just do it instead? Instead, can I just use the 20 seconds just on that?
Yeah, go on.
On that Gen Z point, but from the previous one, because I don't think we answered that so much. But a slide I had to cut from my way too many slides was exactly that question that David, the most people can be trusted one. That has always been quite generationally together in the UK, unlike the US, where Bob Putnam's work showed that it was very coming apart. But this survey is the first one where we see a generational gap that goes in strict generational order: pre-war baby boomer, Gen X, millennials, and then Gen Z at the bottom. And it's like a 25 percentage point gap from top to bottom in the generations. That's the first time that we've seen that. And it's one data point, one wave of this type of thing. But it is something that's happened in other countries about this generational difference in trust. And that is a big problem. And I kind of believe it. I've never been like...
There's probably a book in it, actually.
There is. I've never been a big talker up of generational difference on those types of trust-based things, but there's something there, and there's something particularly there with Gen Z that we really need to take seriously.
It's been an absolutely, I mean, I've just sat here as chair, been absolutely stonking panel, stonking session, stonking audience, fantastic. I mean, the big point I think we all take away is that a public polarised question mark, thank God for the question mark, that is what we're talking about. To Bobby, to Maria, to Gabby and to David, thank you very much indeed. See you for a drink.
Outside.